Okay, thank you, Jay, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to Credo. Our speaker for today, as I think you already know, is Helms. Ann has been a member of our community for 26 years, and during that time, she's done lots of taken on lots of volunteer responsibilities. She's currently on the board and on the stewardship committee, and she's helped with our children in RE and many other things. Anyhow, we're very glad to have Ann here today, and in a moment I'll turn it over to her. I just want to say she will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of question answer. If you want to ask a question, do it by typing it into chat. If you want to go ahead even while she's talking and type something into chat, you can. So I believe that's it. We'll turn things over to Ann, and thank you, Ann.
Thank you. And I think I'll come in a little under 20 minutes because writing and talking for radio has taught me to keep things tight. So I'm going to date myself a bit by bracketing my credo with references to Northern Exposure. That's a TV series that had a bit of a cult following in the 1990s. And if you were one of those fans, right now you are probably picturing that moose walking down the main street of Sicily, Alaska in the opening credits. If you're not a fan, the premise was that a young doctor from New York City had been sent to this remote small town as a requirement of his student loan. He had to work in an underserved medical community for 2 years to get his loan forgiven. And he was not happy about this assignment. So it wasn't a medical drama. It was kind of explored the culture clashes as Dr. Fleischman reluctantly became a part of this delightfully quirky community. So Dr. Fleischman's receptionist was Marilyn Whirlwind, who was an indigenous Tlingit woman. And in one episode, Marilyn makes reference to the power of healing stories. And Dr. Fleischman is baffled. He says, "We don't have those." And she says, "Of course you do. Every culture has healing stories." So she sets out to prove her point, and there's a montage of Marilyn asking all the white characters to tell her those stories. They respond with puzzled looks and false starts. They tell jokes, they tell urban legends. And she concludes that it's true. White people don't have healing stories, and maybe that's what's wrong with them. So my first impression was, wow, that's deep. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it's clever, but it's wrong. The culture I grew up in has all sorts of stories that give our lives shape and meaning, that tell us how to live in the world. There's that amazing collection of stories that starts with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God." Now, I personally learned my Bible stories from an illustrated collection in the dentist's office. We were not a church-going family. So to me, those stories were mostly intriguing and sometimes quite puzzling. But for many, those are profoundly healing stories. Our culture has great children's stories and classic literature, stories that teach us about good and evil, overcoming obstacles, finding love. We've created a multitude of movies and TV shows, and yeah, a lot of them are trash, but many of them carry messages that shape us and heal us. A credo is supposed to be about what we give our hearts to, and have always given my heart and mind to stories. I was one of those kids who learned to read the way I learned to walk and talk. It just happened. And by the time I reached school, I felt most at home in two settings: playing outside and exploring nature, or sitting inside with my nose in a book and traveling to other worlds. So I'm going to get a disappointing confession out of the way now. I don't write fiction. No short stories, no unpublished novel, never had the ability, never really had the drive. I blame my parents. I've read so many interviews in which authors talk about how their childhood was so miserable that they had to create imaginary worlds. My parents raised me and my brother with love and security. So for whatever reason, I'm not a creative writer. But in high school, I did figure out that journalists get paid to talk to people who are more interesting than they are and to tell those people's stories. What a sweet deal. So I became a newspaper reporter in the time of Woodward and Bernstein and Watergate, when that calling had a power and status that I think younger generations can barely imagine. But one more confession, I've never been a great investigative reporter. Instead, I've come to see myself as a community storyteller, and it's been such a joy and an honor to fulfill that role, first for newspapers and now more recently for public radio. So I've always been aware that the stories of my culture had shortcomings. Many of the stories from my childhood were variations on the theme of male hero has daring adventures and wins the hand of the beautiful princess. That didn't work for me. I was never a princess, and I wanted to be the hero, not somebody else's prize. Fortunately, I had the feminist movement of the 1970s to follow. And in the 1990s, about the time I was falling in love with Northern exposure, I also came across feminist spirituality. I was so intrigued that I volunteered to write a feature for the Charlotte Observer. I was talking to one woman who was leading a class called Cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and I asked her, "Do you literally believe in and worship goddesses?" She laughed and said, "At my church, we don't think any religious stories are meant to be taken literally. They're all metaphors." I was stunned. That was exactly what I believed, but I was pretty sure you weren't supposed to say that out loud in the South and in a church. As you've probably guessed, the church was this one. The woman was Darlene Reisner, who was the wife of the minister who preceded Jay. And the connection was one that changed my life. As I've mentioned, I had a great childhood, and I got most of my values from my parents. But there's one way I was different. My family was very focused on the nuclear family. We loved and cared for each other, but we weren't deeply connected to much of anyone else. For reasons I still don't really understand, I've always wanted to be a part of a bigger community. Now, being a reporter makes you part of a community, but in a limited way. You have to become a mirror who can reflect everyone else, and that means you don't show your opinions and beliefs. Newsrooms can be a great community. They're full of smart, funny, irreverent people, but there's still a limit on how deep you go with your work buddies. It took me a while to really open up here, but UUCC eventually became my Sicily, Alaska, the place where I fit in with all my quirks and beliefs, and where we could explore together what really matters. We're actually encouraged to tell and revise our own stories through these very Credo sessions. This is my 5th or 6th one, counting Credos for coming of age, and each one has taught me something new about myself and the world as I experience it. One of the most important things I've done within this community is to explore how our stories shape us, how they heal us, and how they harm us. The whole boy meets girl framework, it turns out, is nice enough, but it's also a bit of the heterosexual agenda being forced down our throats, to steal an unpleasant phrase. And now I'm learning that even the whole boy and girl thing is not as clear-cut as I once thought it was. I'm not a huge fan of cop stories, mostly because of the violence, although I do love a great Elizabeth George or Louise Penny murder mystery. But I still absorb the underlying premise that police are the good guys, smart people with cutting-edge technology, and of course guns, who protect us from the bad guys. It took a lot of brutal, heartbreaking videos to make me realize that the us being protected was never as broad as I thought it was. That narrative may have been comforting to some of us, but it was lethal to others. There were the stories that were taught as history in the 1960s and 70s, where white Europeans discovered this country and led it on a path to freedom, democracy, and prosperity. I'm ashamed to admit that the phrase I most remember from studying Reconstruction is carpetbaggers and scallywags. It was presented as a quaint anachronism, not a rallying cry to wage war against Black people who were trying to claim their freedom and democratic rights. I was an adult before I realized that lynching wasn't something that happened to cattle rustlers in cowboy movies. The story that white people of my generation told ourselves about race in America was slavery was bad, segregation was bad, the heroes of the civil rights movement bravely fought to end it, and we lived happily ever after in a colorblind society. Again, healing and comforting to people like me, but false and profoundly harmful to people of color. One of the many tough realizations for me has been that those newsrooms where I had so much fun, where I could let down my guard and feel supported, generally were not that way for my Black colleagues. For them, it was often just one more place where you had to keep being a mirror, reflecting back what white people wanted to see. We have the Horatio Alger stories, and no, I'm not actually old enough to have read them, but for my generation, that was shorthand for the notion that a scrappy young man could start with nothing and with enough brains, nerve, and hard work become someone. And of course, becoming someone meant having money and a respectable lifestyle. That notion that having a college education, having a professional job, having a financially stable life means that you are someone and reflects your own personal merit, that's one that I have to admit has been really hard for me to shake. I had grandparents who worked their way from poverty to comfort, well, grandfathers. I understood intellectually that they had opportunities that weren't open to people of color, or women for that matter. But it's been hard for me to grasp that even though we didn't own plantations or factories, some of my family's opportunities, and therefore some of my opportunities, came at the expense of others. Recently, I've been thinking that maybe the problem isn't just with the content of our stories, but with their basic structure. There's the focus on individual action, the idea that we can all transcend our history and our circumstances and take on the world on our own. That's so deeply embedded in the mythology I grew up with that it feels wrong to even question it, but it does need questioning. There's the sorting into good guys and bad guys and extras. The idea that some stories are more worth telling, that some lives matter and others don't. Maybe that's the kind of story that helped us get where we are today. And where we are today is devastating. I've reached a point in my life where ideally I'd be sharing the stories of my people with grandchildren. Instead, I'm more or less standing in the ruins of those stories. I'm questioning not just what I've heard and watched and read, but if I'm honest, also what I've written and told to my larger community. How much did my filters perpetuate the stories that healed some people and harmed others? How many voices did I fail to hear because they didn't talk the way I did, or have the right credentials, or just never entered my world? I do take heart from hearing new stories and voices that don't sound like mine, that use new media, that demand new things of me. Just hearing Amanda Gorman recite the inaugural poem, or watching a Black woman firefighter lead the Pledge of Allegiance in sign language, that's enough to offer a glimmer of hope. It's like getting access to the whole library and realizing I'd been confined to the children's section all along. But the hard part is realizing that in a lot of those stories, my people are the bad guys. So where do I go from here? Where do we go from here? And that brings me to one more episode of Northern Exposure. This one came well into the second season, where people like me had gotten really invested in these characters. It centered on Maurice, who was a retired astronaut, kind of a Ronald Reagan conservative patriot. He was full of bluster and macho rhetoric, but of course he was a beloved part of that community, flaws and all. So a Russian visitor comes to Sicily, and somehow he and Maurice got into a dispute that ended with the Russian challenging Maurice to a duel. Now, the general gun culture in Sicily seemed to be pretty much what my dad described growing up in rural Iowa in the 1940s. Everybody has guns and knows how to use them, but you don't turn them on each other and you don't use them to settle your beefs. But Maurice's sense of honor doesn't allow him to back down. So at sunrise, the whole town is lined up to watch this thing that no one wants to happen. Maurice and the Russians start pacing off their steps. 7, 8, 9. When Dr. Fleischman breaks in and says, wait a minute, our audience isn't going to buy this. They know Maurice isn't going to kill the Russian, and they sure know we're not going to let the Russian kill Maurice. And all of a sudden, the characters, or maybe the actors, start arguing about whether they have to follow a lousy script. Finally, Meryl in Whirlwind says, why don't we go on to the next scene? It's a pretty good one. And they all trudge off through the snow. My first reaction was, wait a minute, what a cop-out. But that was one of those scenes that clung like a burr. I had figured out pretty early that being a functioning human being meant creating mental shortcuts and following a lot of social scripts. I found myself wondering, what would it look like to break the script when the script is just wrong? Well, here we are watching the most toxic stories of white America play out. The guns are out and we're counting out the paces to turn them on each other. I suspect a lot of us have thought hard lately about what we'd be willing to die for or even kill for. Here's the thing, as much as I hate to admit it, I'm not sure I have the courage or the creativity to break this script. But what I have learned is that I'm kind of good at helping to connect and sustain a community of creative, courageous people. So maybe I don't get to be the individual hero, but maybe we in the very broad sense, can figure out how to break this script. So thank you for being here. I believe that one of the greatest gifts anyone can give another person is to listen to their story, and I am honored that you gave me that gift.
Thank you so much, Anne. We really appreciate your sharing your story with us, and to some degree, a lot of what you said is our stories as well for many of us. So I'm going to turn now. We're going to go to question answer, and if you've written some questions or if you want to go write some now, I'm going to go turn to see what we have here. And let's see. From one who believes in the power of story, I honor and appreciate you, Anne. That's one person. That's not a question, but anyhow. You said you were raised in a religious tradition. What experiences or exposure did you have with friends, classmates, exposure to the religious tradition and to their religious tradition? And did that have any effect on you? Maybe especially as being a mentor for COA, coming of age.
So I grew up in Kokomo, Indiana, and religion did not permeate our atmosphere the way I think it does in the South. I kind of knew that my friends went to church, but it just wasn't a thing that we talked about much. My parents kind of tried to just be very low key because they felt like being openly non-religious might be offensive. But I did in 6th grade, the album Jesus Christ Superstar came out, and my best friend introduced me to it. And that intrigued me. I started learning about the Bible then because I thought, oh, this is a really cool story and with great music to boot. And I wanted to know that story. So I sat down and read the Bible cover to cover. And like I say, it was really confusing and often tedious and often bizarrely dramatic. But it didn't really become, I actually did try to go to church a little bit. I walked down the street to a Presbyterian church, and the whole predestination thing was like, yeah, I don't get that. So it really wasn't until I got to college that I started really being intrigued by other people's religion. And my freshman year roommate was a Jehovah's Witness. So you can imagine we had some really interesting discussions. And looking back, I did a lot of what I think we sometimes as individuals and a congregation, even in the past, have done, which is just demolish those silly literalist beliefs. And I did that with my roommate. I'm not really proud of that because to me it was an intellectual exercise, and to her this was her identity. And she did not end up staying a Jehovah's Witness. She came to agree that it didn't work, but that was when I really started saying, this is really a big, important thing for a lot of people. And I kind of envied them the power of the traditions and the music and the beliefs, even though I never came to literally embrace any of them. So yeah, that, being a coming of age mentor, being an RE teacher, I loved when we played Jesus Christ Superstar for, I think it was maybe the 5th and 6th grade group when my son was in that. And they were just like, oh, this is so cool. So that's a long rambling answer.
Here's a question. What do you find to be frustrating and what do you do about it?
Oh, like in life and stories, I mean, kind of, I guess coming up against my own limitations is a big one. I think it helps when you're young to have that sort of naive overconfidence. I don't know how I could have moved to Macon, Georgia, which was nothing like anything I had ever experienced. And as a 21, 22-year-old kid, basically jumped in and said, sure, I can cover City Hall. Sure, I can. I was actually first assigned to cover minority affairs, which was basically the civil rights movement in Macon, Georgia. I truly thought that was just something you read about in the history books. And I was so naive. It was a great learning experience for me. But I was kind of like, yeah, I can do anything. Yeah, here I am. And again, now I recognize that there was a lot of white privilege and confidence that came from feeling like I could walk into any situation and be treated with respect and try to define the story. So, we all joke about how you get dumber as your kids get older. My son's 31. I'm getting older and I just feel like I'm getting more clueless by the day. Like I said, I just finished reading a book by a former McClatchy colleague who I knew just kind of in passing, Isaac Bailey, who was a columnist for The Observer, and about just what he experienced in the McClatchy newsrooms at the time I was there. And it was not what I was experiencing. So it's just, there's humility, but there's also that feeling of, wow, all these things that I thought I did so well, maybe I've still got a lot of learning to do.
2 fingers to the bottom.
I'm doing it. Just a second. Can you scroll up? Okay. One person just said, thank you, Anne. Very thoughtful. I love the Northern exposure references. Are you now consciously trying to listen to other or new stories? And if so, are there stories that now stand out for you?
Ooh, when it is TV series, which of course now is mostly streaming because it's become so hard to follow anything, on an actual network. I'm kind of a passive. My husband chooses a lot of those, although at our last board meeting, Alicia Hutto mentioned The Watchman, which not really my kind of thing. It's it's based on a superhero alternative universe where, giant alien squids drop in and, but it is so powerful about the racial dynamics now. And she had said, oh my God, I've just finished this and I wish I could just start it again. So I said, Carrie, download it for us. It was uncomfortable because we started watching it kind of leading up to the transfer of power, and we watched the last 3 episodes after January 6th. And it is, dystopian fiction is a lot more fun when you're not in a dystopian reality that's a lot like that. It is amazing how much that has to say in a way that is both bizarrely surreal and just horrifically real at the time. Reading, I always have this weird assortment of, and I was just thinking about how, I just finished Isaac Bailey's book. Now I'll probably read a novel because, his book is really hard and painful to read. But then I thought, that being, I only have to experience his world at a remove. Now I get to retreat back into my world. That's privilege right there.
What might you say to someone who says they cannot believe the New York Times or the Washington Post?
I don't know. This idea that we are in just such alternative realities is really hard to grapple with, because I did grow up at a time when there were errors, and then in the 90s, it became a right-wing thing to say, oh, the mainstream media is not unbiased. And so I really kind of came to terms with, well, of course, we're not totally unbiased. It is ridiculous to expect that we would have no opinions about the world around us, especially in this time. But, so to me, the definition I came to was, I have my beliefs, but I have to contain them in a way that it doesn't interfere with my reporting. If I stake myself out as essentially a member of a team, A, people are not going to believe I'm objective, so there's going to be that barrier. But also B, I'm kind of then become vested in seeing my side win. It can become more like a debate team thing where I'll use the facts, but I'll pick them selectively to bolster my case. And I think as journalists, we have to be more like researchers. Yes, you start with a premise. You don't just go out and like willy-nilly sling out all the facts that you encountered that day. You have to start with something that you're exploring and you think it's important but you have to present it in a way. And sometimes I feel like I've done that really well. I think I have better standing in, I won't say the far right wing, the far, the enemy, media, the enemy of the people. I just don't know how you even communicate with those people. But with the fairly conservative, I think it's fairly well known. Everybody knows what church I belong to. I think our church is fairly established as where we are with some issues. I'm fairly open about grappling with race, but I try to do it in a way that it's not saying, you racists over there are bad people because, and I'm now superior. I kind of try to phrase it as, this is something that people like me have had trouble with. So, and I've rambled so far from the question that I'm not even sure what it was now. I don't know if I answered it.
Here's another one. When and how do you write? What is your routine?
Well, again, I'm not doing creative writing. And I think that's partly because it's such a time demand. And that really depends. I've had to relearn how to write for radio. And that's been interesting because you have to make things much simpler and clearer. That, sometimes I read out loud, like the first sentence of especially New York Times obituaries. You can't do it in one breath. You're going to like pass out like you're trying to read. And then, after you get to the guy's whole biography, died yesterday, it's like, no, you can't do that on radio. You've got to. So I have learned to write differently. I take notes differently because I really definitely need to have sound whenever possible. And sound editing is kind of fun and interesting. But it's kind of, you're getting messages. I think social media are great. It means you can hear from more people. I have a much more diverse Facebook group of friends, much larger and more diverse than my group of actual real face-to-face friends. So I'm hearing from more people, but it's just constant. So I, for the most part, don't try to, I've tried journaling at various points. At the end of every year, I write sort of a memory of my year, my family's year, because I figure nobody else is going to keep track of that. But just daily writing, I'm not doing that much.
Maybe the person was asking about when do you do your writing that you do for WFAE? Is
Yeah, and
that
that's
on any kind of
mostly during the work days. And again, we have had some, we've all had to learn how to do things from home that used to be, newscasters used to go in the studio and do that. I now have a bunch of equipment here so I can do it from home. There is nothing more terrifying than when that mic goes live and suddenly my little back room here is what's going out over WFAE. And if I have a coughing fit or something, knock on wood, that hasn't happened yet. I've stumbled over some words. I've had some awkward, everybody does. That's not the end of the world. But so that's very fast writing with other people's material. With my material, it's just during the workday. That's actually a very satisfying point to me where I say, I've got, whether it's one great interview or 3 or 4, and now I am going to sit down and again, it has to be, if I've had 3, maybe 4 paragraphs of me talking, I have to be thinking really hard about how to get some more sound in there, because people don't want to just tune in and hear, there's Anne going on and on. They want to hear some other voices. And I've always tried to make sure there's some diversity, that I'm not just quoting the same, because I actually did realize I was sort of quoting the white school board members more often. And maybe that was because they sounded like what I thought people should sound like, sometimes articulating things. So I've made a real point, and now we institutionally are trying to track. That's actually a chore I need to get back to, is entering, all my sources in the diversity tracker. I don't know what we'll do with it, but there's just it's kind of okay, now I have this slice of time and I have to try really hard not to get distracted by everything else that comes across my screen.
Well, Anne, our time is up, and for all of the rest of you, our time is about up. And I know several of you had some more comments, but this is all we had time for today. But Anne, thank you so much. What you said was fascinating and really thought-provoking, and you really stimulated us to think also about racial and other issues and about what our own stories are and how we tell them. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here. That's again a real honor that some of you, I know nobody wants another Zoom on a Sunday morning, but you're here and I appreciate it.
We do want this one. Thank you so much, and goodbye, and thank you to everybody for joining us.